And welcome to The Bottom Line, where we unpack some of the main business and economic stories of the day. Social media might be full of memes from the inauguration, but President Trump is already busy signing executive orders carrying out his campaign promises. Donald Trump is all action and has just renewed his tariff threats against the EU and China. To share what this means for us in Europe and how it impacts our transatlantic relationship, we are joined by Bruegel research fellow Niclas Poitiers. Hello, and thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
So I wanted to start with some of the news stories that are circulating today. Trump is seeing through on his commitment to strike China and the EU with tariffs. And based on what the US president told reporters at a news conference late yesterday, China seems to be number one in the firing line, but the EU doesn't seem to be immune. And I just wanted to take a quote. The European Union is very, very bad to us, so they're going to be in for tariffs. It's the only way you're going to get fairness. And I wanted to ask you, how do you interpret those words from the point of view of perhaps primarily the EU and perhaps also the Central and Eastern European region?
It's very hard to tell because we don't know actually how much he means of this. We had in the last Trump administration, we had a lot of talks about things like border walls. We had also a lot of tariff threats. And in the end, not everything happened, but a lot happened. And we don't know to which extent he actually means to follow through with these. If he would really make real his campaign promises of put a 10-20% tariff on the rest of the world, this would be very expensive for America. This also would have a big impact on the EU. But it could also be more nuanced. It could be a way of getting concessions that are maybe Europe buying more gas from the United States and not have a huge impact in the end. So it's very hard to tell at this point. But I think the EU would be well advised to brace for conflict.
But tariffs are clearly a priority for President Trump, and perhaps the greatest source of concern here in Central and Eastern Europe, keeping in mind the economic situation that we are riddled with. And we also have spoken to Raffaella Tenconi, chief economist at Wood & Co. And she shared their forecast of approximately 0.5% of GDP value that might actually be shaved off here in our region. Do you agree with those figures and perhaps those forecasts, which are quite concerning?
Indeed, this forecast is in line with forecasts we've seen from other institutions, so it seems about the right order of magnitude. It depends a lot on basically specific of these tariffs. It could be that certain companies, certain industries are exempt. We see a lot of lobbying activities on this. We have seen this in the past. And of course, it depends to which extent Trump wants to follow through on all of this. It also depends on basically the effect of tariffs on third parties. If there's, for instance, a 60% tariff on China, European goods might become relatively more cheaper, even though we have now higher tariffs on European goods relative to our Chinese competitors. So there's a lot of things at play, but something of this order of magnitude, like the study suggests, seems right.
And perhaps it's a matter of simply importing more US goods, and in particular energy. Is it perhaps simply, I say simply in inverted commas, figuring out a trading deal as opposed to fixating on this threat of trade wars, tariff wars? Is there a way of perhaps figuring out a way that will satisfy both parties? After all, Trump is a businessman.
Indeed. So this is what happened last time. We had the threat of big automotive tariffs from the United States, and Europe made some concessions to the United States in terms of purchasing agreements. It could be that there's a deal like this to be made this time around again, but it's not clear. Some of the folks in the Trump camp, they want tariffs not just to hit out against Europe and other trading partners. They also want to protect domestic workers from foreign competition. And if this is the goal, then the tariffs, it doesn't really matter if we buy other goods. They really want the tariffs for their own sake, for the workers' sake. So it really depends on whether these tariffs are a means to get other concessions, or are they actually an end in themselves.
And if we were to just zoom in a little bit, assuming that things go ahead as Trump says that they will, what industries would be affected the most, especially in the Central and Eastern European region?
generally the industries that are export oriented and the industries that are export oriented towards the United States. So one of the big ones that he keeps talking about and that is likely to be included in these tariffs is the automotive industry. We also can think of other capital goods industries that export to the United States, but it probably will basically face everything. A lot of it depends on basically the specifics on the industries. So how export oriented are they generally, how easy it is for them to diversify to other measures. The more concentrated your business is on the United States, the more you're exposed. But this exposure is also indirect. We already see today that export oriented economies like Germany are suffering from a decline in world markets, not just the United States, but also China. And of course, all the supplying industries to these industries are affected themselves. So there's a lot of ripple effects. Generally, I think everything around automotive will have a hard time, but but other industries as well.
And what about Poland? Because Poland is in a particular situation in that the reality of these tariffs in the end will impact day-to-day life, but Poland will also enjoy the benefits of EU funds coming in this year, and obviously the country will want to put them to good use. Can you tell us, as time goes on, assuming the tariffs kick in, how we might be able to see these tariffs come through in day-to-day life?
So we see in general the issue that export-oriented businesses are not doing well across the EU. If you're a country, for instance, like Spain, Southern Europe, that benefits mostly from domestic services, from domestic consumers, these countries tend to do very well. But other economies that are more oriented toward exporting goods and goods to China, to the United States, their business is getting more difficult because the Chinese economy is not doing well, and now Trump will likely impose tariffs on us. The question for policymakers in the EU and in Poland in particular is now how they want to use public funds in this situation. Do they want to ease the pain for the industries and the workers that are affected by the decline in domestic foreign demand, or do they want to invest in new growing industries that might be more services-oriented, more internal-oriented, more innovation-oriented? And we see right now a lot of the industrial policy is very much focused on easing the pain for the industries that are hit by declining demand. But this, of course, is not really a recipe for growth. It's just a way to ease the pain. It doesn't really generate growth in itself. And at some point, you will have to pivot.
And now I wanted to just take a little pivot towards expenditure because Poland and the US have actually enjoyed quite a solid relationship over the last few years, even more than that actually. And Poland has led on defense expenditure in NATO. Do you think that this actually might be a factor that will allow Trump to treat different EU member states differently when it comes to imposing tariffs on European countries? Essentially, I'm asking about, do you think that any special treatment might be extended?
I believe or I expect that Trump will be very keen on divide and rule. He will try to pick individual EU member states, try to give them a preferential treatment if they vote in favor of US interests in the Council, and if they undermine a strong response from the Union as a whole. I would warn against trying to play that game because Trump is not trustworthy. He will change his mind, and he has changed his mind in the past. And you might get a good deal today, but it doesn't mean you get a good deal in a couple of years' time. I think here it's very important that we have in the European Union, we have a common line, we have a common understanding of where we go. And individual member states should leverage the good relationship or the better relationship they might have with the Trump administrations. We see Giorgia Meloni of Italy doing this very successfully, at least until now. But I would warn against trying to play this out against the common interest of the Union, because basically so much is at stake, and every individual member state is too small to really stand up to an aggressive Trump trade policy.
Mm-hmm. And now just focusing back on Poland a little bit. For this year, one of the goals that Poland has is actually developing its fintech industry, investing in R&D. It's actually quite an urgent priority, but Poland has actually faced the news of entering that tier 2 access when it comes to American chips. And obviously this is something that has to be addressed quite urgently. With your expertise, how would you say that Poland should go about it best in the current circumstances, obviously facing the threat of tariffs as well, and things are actually tensing up a little bit in that transatlantic sense?
I think this is a good example for how important it is for Europe to stand with one voice and have a clear line together here. From a EU perspective, it's really problematic that basically some countries in the EU are tier 2 now and basically face some type of export restrictions, where others are not. And these are the kind of divide and rule tactics that we might see more of in the future. And I think here there has to be a very clear coordination of how Europe wants to react to this type of export controls, how it wants to align its own industries and in its own policies. Because we also see some export controls when it comes, for instance, to Hungary that are there because there's also a lack of trust between some EU member states. And it's very important that we build up the institutions and the mechanisms to deal with these type of export controls that in the end divide the single market that is so important for European growth.
And I actually wanted to refer to a quote from your colleague, Ignacio Garcia Berquero. I might be butchering his surname. So he's currently a co-fellow at Bruegel, but he has experience as a former director at the European Commission and also a former EU-US trade negotiator. And he says that the EU has to be ready for all eventualities, and he doesn't think that Trump's first move will be as radical as 10 to 20% tariffs across the board because of how disruptive that would actually be for the US. So what kind of implementation do you think we should be expecting as a first move, perhaps, from Trump? Very briefly as we wrap up our conversation.
I agree with Ignacio. I would expect we see some kind of ramp up. This ramp up can have different forms. It could be that they first pick particular countries to test their tariff policy, which might, for instance, target Mexico and Canada. It could be that they basically start with smaller tariffs and ramp them up. From the news reporting that we see out of the Trump administration, of the Trump transition team, it's not even clear that they made up their mind within the Trump transition team itself. But I think there's an understanding that imposing across-the-board tariffs against the rest of the world at a very high level would be very disruptive and would also not go very well with the business community that is important to Donald Trump. Therefore, I think we can see some ramping up. It could take different forms in terms of sectoral approach, in terms of a country-by-country approach, in terms of basically starting at a low tariff base and then ramping it up until it becomes too painful. But what we've seen in the past is that actually Donald Trump stopped his escalation with China at the moment where actually he saw that this has direct impact on its businesses and on its popularity in the United States. And I expect a similar approach might happen now.
Okay.
Having said that, I think we should expect a very aggressive policy, and we should be prepared for a trade war.
Okay, Niclas, thank you so much for joining us. Great to hear your insight.
It was a pleasure.
And we were joined by Niclas Poitiers from Bruegel. Thanks so much for joining us today. I was your host, Marie Cato. Join us every weekday for Business Arena at 5 p.m. CET on TVP World. And for the latest in regional business, follow us on X and on tvpworld.com. And for more news and features, stay with us on TVP World. Goodbye.